Welcome to episode 214 of Angela Watson's Truth for Teachers. I'm your host, Angela Watson, and I'm here to speak life, encouragement, and truth into the minds and hearts of educators and get you energized for the week ahead. Today, I'm talking with Dr. Catlin Tucker about some practical tips for simplifying your workload in blended learning, including assessment, virtual station rotations, student engagement, and more. Visit truthforteachers.com to get the transcript, or find our Truth for Teachers podcast community on Facebook. Instead of the typical mention from our podcast sponsors this week, I wanted to share about some resources of my own that you might not realize I offer. I've created more than 70 downloadable and printable resources for teachers. The Teacher's Box of Tricks is a set of 35 no-prep practice activities that you can plug into almost any lesson for any grade level and subject area. They're designed to have kids construct their own learning rather than having you create all the content on your own time and then just pass it out for students to consume. Even test prep becomes a highly engaging activity that encourages critical thinking and discussion and collaboration. And that's just the Teacher's Box of Tricks. I've also created math partner games for grades K to 5, discussion starters for math problem solving, feedback comments for student writing, an editable one-trait rubric, and a report card comment system that's designed to take half the time of your current process. There's also several resources for executive functioning, including a clean desk diagram for teaching organization to kids, along with growth mindset and working memory activities. The most recent addition is emergency subplans for every grade level K to 12. I co-created these with a team of practicing classroom teachers to make sure we're producing high-quality, rigorous activities that kids can do when you're absent. To learn about any of these printable resources or discover what else I've created, just go to truthforteachers.com. In the navigation menu, you'll find links to all my printables. Thank you for supporting my work. Each purchase helps make it possible for the many, many free materials that I offer, like this podcast, to be available to educators everywhere at no cost. I've invited Dr. Catlin Tucker on the show today because I've been so impressed with the quality of the blended and online resources that she shares on her site and on Twitter. Catlin was a classroom teacher for 16 years, and she currently teaches pre-service educators at the university level. She's also a blended learning coach and an educational consultant, author, and keynote speaker. What I appreciate most about Catlin's work is that she was passionate about blending online and face-to-face learning before the pandemic, and she has many years of experience in this methodology, coupled with the fact that she tackles the really practical aspects of the workload that we don't often hear a lot about. It's one thing to tell teachers, prioritize relationships, make connections with students in remote learning, and it's quite another thing to say, here are some specific things that you can say and do with students to build those connections. And here's a couple free Google slide templates that you can copy and edit in order to use these ideas with your kids right away. That's the kind of work that Catlin does, and I've seen her share these things consistently for a long time. So I'm thrilled to have her on Truth for Teachers to talk about some of the most time-consuming aspects of teaching remotely and in a hybrid setting. A lot of people have asked me to do an episode on managing assessment, engagement, group work, and other aspects of teaching that look very different in an online environment. So my hope is that this episode will give you some solid practical strategies to help streamline your workload. I also encourage you to click through to the blog post for this episode, the link's in the show notes, or just go to truthforteachers.com and you can find episode 214. I'm going to link to some of my favorite templates and lessons that Catlin has made available so you can find all the best stuff from her in one place on my site. Enjoy. So, Catlin, I talk a lot with teachers about figuring out what's most important and letting the rest go. And often I find that folks want to really clearly define lists. They want to be told, do this, don't do that, this is worthwhile, this is not worthwhile. But I've found that figuring out what to devote more time to and what to cut out is a really individualized process. It depends a lot on the teacher, on the district, and on the individual students who are in the class. So in your work as a blended learning coach and also in your work as a teacher, how have you helped educators navigate this process during a school year when it's so hard to figure out what you should be focusing on?
It is so hard. And I think your point about it's very individual is true, because there are some teachers who are kind of getting the message from leadership that like, no, you've got a pacing guide, you got to stick to it. You got standards, you got to stick to it. And then there are other districts that they are more flexible in their approach. And so that has a big impact on how comfortable teachers feel really making some choices about what to prioritize. And when I work with them, my message is, if you can just embrace a less is more a kind of approach for this year on a bunch of different fronts, like maybe by trying to race through less content and cover what we were used to covering, we give ourselves a break and kind of just recognize that by maybe focusing on a handful of kind of priority standards, those key concepts we want students to know, those key skills they are really going to need for whatever class comes next that's going to build on our content area, and then just focus on really rich, engaging, meaningful learning experiences around those. Because I see a lot of teachers beating themselves up, quite frankly, because they're like, oh my gosh, this time last year, the year before, I was at this totally different place in my curriculum, and somehow I think they see that as a fault, and it's not their fault. This is a very unique year on so many different levels for us, for our students. And so just kind of taking a step back and realizing you can't replicate the school day online. You can't replicate it, the way we've done it in the past in a hybrid or a concurrent classroom. And so for me, it's really, how do we bring that kind of like frame and focus, which is a great quote from Jay McTighe, who talks about using essential questions to do that, to really think about what's most important. How do we really shine a light on that? And then quite frankly, another piece of this is what kids need from us right now is connection. And how are we designing learning experiences to prioritize that human side of teaching, that connection with learners, whether it's connecting around talking about progress and goals or connecting around real-time feedback, but they need that connection and support right now.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think more and more teachers and more school leaders and districts are learning to prioritize socioemotional learning and relationships. Of course, the problem is sometimes it feels like it's competing with time for the content area. So, do you have any advice for teachers who feel like, I want to prioritize relationships with my kids? I want to be really student centered. I want to really focus on seeing them as human beings with feelings and needs and emotions, and not just little robots who are here to download information. I want to do that, but I don't feel like there's time to do that and time to teach content.
Right. It's interesting that it does feel a bit like a dichotomy. These things are not separate, right? Our social and emotional selves are all wrapped up in our intellectual selves as well. I don't think that it's like, ooh, if we spend some time over here, then that means I can't, they're mutually exclusive, right? That learning and that academic focus versus that social emotional, the relationship building, helping students to develop that social presence, which is so critical. And so for me, it's about, where are the overlap in opportunities where we can really drive some dynamic learning while also allowing students to engage in conversation, to build relationships, to develop trust with each other? And so when, I work with teachers, one of the simple strategies, and I know it's not simple to get started, but one of the simple ways in which to start really connecting learners and allowing them the space to idea share and connect with other humans, even if they're entirely online, is with discussion, right? Like, what form does discussion take in our classes? Because thanks to Flipgrid, you can have first graders having a discussion, right? And maybe those discussions start in more of a relationship building space. So I start every single lesson or every single synchronous session with my teacher candidates with a check-in, just like a kind of a health and wellness kind of check-in or a fun icebreaker question. And the goal is to get them comfortable sharing bits about themselves so that when we lean into that academic discourse, we lean into those academic tasks, they feel safer sharing their feelings, their thoughts, their opinions. They're willing to engage in that kind of honest, open, purposeful conversation, and they feel a sense of group cohesion, that connectedness to this learning community, which is so critical. So I think there are ways to, with discussion, with collaborative kind of creative tasks where we're connecting kids, where we can meet some of that and develop some of that relationship building and give kids that meaningful connection while also still serving some of those academic objectives that we obviously have as teachers.
I know one strategy that you recommend a lot, and you've shared a lot of really helpful resources for, is on virtual stations
Mm-hmm.
and sort of breaking up your class times so that kids are working on different things at different times and sort of rotating through different activities so that they can be working in small groups, they can be collaborating, discussing with peers, and then also so that you can have more individual time to be connecting with them
Mm-hmm.
as the teacher. Can you talk more about just some different ideas for what teachers can be doing with virtual stations and how that might look?
Absolutely. So one of the things that was fascinating is early in the pandemic, I did get a lot of messages on Twitter. People are like, oh my gosh, Catlin, I'm online. Now I can't use station rotation model. Like, I'm really sad about it, because anybody who's taught in a classroom knows it's so much harder to connect with learners in a whole group dynamic than it is in a small group dynamic. So the idea with the station rotation is simply that you have a teacher-led station, you have an online station, you have an offline station. The number of stations doesn't quite frankly matter, but it is about that balance between the online and the offline. And so there's a lot about that approach that appeals to me right now, whether teachers are still exclusively online or whether they're in this like concurrent classroom where they've got kids in class and kids online. It's really hard to meet everybody's needs at one time. And so for me, the teacher-led station is basically, if you're online with kids, you break the group, say, into three. Each smaller group has a time and a link to meet with you. And then you can do anything from, differentiate direct instruction to really engage all the members in kind of interactive modeling sessions, guide practice, give real-time feedback. There's so many dynamic ways to use it. And then when kids are working through the online station, a lot of times teachers really lean on like a program or adaptive software, which is great. But that's just one way to use those stations. We can have kids working through multimedia lessons, right? They could listen to a kid-friendly podcast and do some sketch art, or they could be in a breakout room with a group working on a shared Google slide deck, or crowdsourcing, research and resources on a topic in a Wakelet that they're working on. Or we could have them doing a virtual museum tour, since like none of us get to leave our houses anymore, it feels like how do we give them some experiential virtual kind of, those moments. And so there's just all these cool things that we could think about having kids do in a virtual online station. And then I really want to prioritize that offline learning. Yes, kids are staring at the screens a lot, so they need a break, right? I'm as excited about offline learning as I am about online learning. So can we give them a choice board of options for offline learning? Because I get it. If they're working at home, equity and access, those are huge concerns for us. We don't want to set kids up to, fail because they just don't have access to resources or materials. So we have to build in a high degree of student agency around those tasks. But I think that can be such a powerful way to engage them from afar. And then a lot of teachers will ask, okay, Catlin, that sounds great, but how do I see what they're working on? And my message is, you got to train these kids to treat their offline learning like they're creating a documentary, right? Can they take pictures? Can they do a video, a time lapse, something they can upload and share as evidence of this wonderful work they're doing offline? So I just really like the inherent balance in that design, and just the variety of ways we could get kids kind of engaged with us, with each other online, and with their environment offline.
Yeah, that balance and variety are so important because staring at a screen is so exhausting.
Oh my
And
gosh.
I know that, for me, I hate video meetings. I hate them. I hate having to maintain eye contact with the person while I'm talking to them. I cannot imagine doing that as a child. It must be so, so tough on them. And, there's been so much debate about should we require kids to have cameras on or off. I have taken the position where I think it's better in general to give kids choice there.
Mhm.
And I know that you have gone the same way, but that's what's so cool to me about a station rotation model is that it it breaks things up. It gives variety. It gives kids different ways to be accountable and to show what they're working on without just being expected to turn their camera on and have the entire class looking at them. And I know that some kids also will be more likely to engage when they're in that smaller group and they don't have the eyes of the whole class on them.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think as teachers, it really challenges us like, okay, I'm not going to be a physical presence at this station. So how am I really setting the learner up to lead that experience? How, they become kind of the center of that learning experience, which I think is such an important shift.
What does that look like? I'm curious what you have to say about that, because I use in the classroom, depends so much on what, they technically call proximity control. I don't really love the word control, but
Right.
meaning that when you are in proximity to someone, your energy has an influence on them. They know the teacher is there, is paying attention, is involved in what's happening. And just my presence in the classroom is a huge part of the way that I keep things running smoothly. How do you do that in a breakout room or online?
Somebody was just asking me that. They were, I got a ton of questions on my blog. And one of the questions was, I have a class of 40. This woman really wanted to try a dialogic interview format that I had shared as a great relationship builder. But it's a one-on-one conversation. So when I've done it with a teacher as a coach, and then with my teacher candidates, I open up enough breakout rooms. So for her, that would be 20. So every pair is in one. And she was like, but I can't be in every room. And I was like, no, you can't. We cannot actually be everywhere all the time. And quite frankly, the work that we need to do is cultivating a learning community capable of thriving in those situations. And that's not something there's no silver bullet. That's not something that's done overnight. I think it begins with a real intentional conversation and some work around co-constructing class agreements. What do students think participation online looks like? Like, how many of us have asked that question and really listened to what kids think the answer is? And what do they think would make their interactions with each other online, whether it's in the main room, a breakout room, what have you, asynchronous collaboration, what would make that feel safe, supportive, safe, supportive, respectful. I have words. And then what would make that feel, unsafe? What would make them feel like, maybe I don't want to share an idea, or I don't really feel like this, I can trust the members of this group? Because our kids spend a lot of them spend a lot of time online. Like, a lot of them have experience in this realm. And so can they share? Can we work together to come to some agreements where they feel like they were invited into the process? And they're kids, they're gonna make mistakes. So I think another piece of the puzzle that I've used pretty consistently when supporting teachers is building in a self-assessment for students at the end of that work. Like, how did this go? What was your participation and engagement like? What is it that you still need to work on as we continue to utilize breakout rooms for conversation or collaboration or for whatever the purpose is? So I think it's about raising some awareness about what is actually okay and not okay to do based on what this community has decided. What are some of those consequences that students feel are appropriate for missteps online? That's always a fascinating conversation, because kids are so much more stern with themselves than I would ever be, the consequences they come up with. And then really it's about practice and reflection and refining. And I think if we're committed to cultivating a community, we have to accept if it's a process. We have to accept that part of our work as teachers is guiding that cultivation, and it's that culture is built over time. It's really a series of behaviors that are reinforced and shared values. And so that really does have to be led by the teacher, but it should actively engage the students as well.
So that's a matter of talking about expectations beforehand, talking about what is a safe and respectful space, and really setting that up, practicing it, and then having students self-assess afterwards, reflect on it.
I think so. I think those are really important pillars to creating a class culture that is going to thrive in the long term. And just, giving students a little bit of grace around knowing that they're young, and this is for them still a very new learning landscape. And they're very, they may be figuring out, and there may be parts of it they're going to stumble, and that has to be okay. We have to have a way to support them in that process. And I really don't want teachers making decisions from a place of fear, like, oh, I don't think students will be successful. I don't think they'll utilize the breakout room time effectively. I'm not going to try this. If we don't believe they can do it, then they can't. We have to believe they're capable, and we have to support them in developing those critical skills. Because I think all the skills they're learning right now around communication and engagement and collaboration in breakout rooms, these are not skills that are going away. They will need these in the future to continue being successful.
Mhm. Let's talk a little bit more about assessment. I agree with having students self-assess is really important because it's not just the teacher handing down a decree about how well they've mastered content. It really requires them to reflect on their own progress and set their own goals. But I know that assessment has been a really tough area for teachers to navigate this school year. Some of them are being required to assess kids like normal and hold kids to the normal
Mhm.
standards. I know you have feelings about that, as do I.
I have a lot of feelings about that,
Well,
actually.
well, let's talk about that first, and then we'll talk about what do we do.
Okay, so long before the pandemic, I have had a lot of concerns about the kind of traditional approaches to assessment, period. And I went through a whole evolution myself as a teacher, which is why I think it's so top of mind for me, because I describe in my last book, Balance with Blended Learning, that I felt very much like in the early years of my teaching career, like the Oprah Winfrey of points. Like, oh, you get points and you get points. Like everybody's getting points. You did your annotations, you did your homework, you did this assignment. And I always had that like unease when I was reporting grades where I was like, oh, this student's getting an A, but the student isn't A level skills or ability, right? They're just jumping through all the hoops. So it's more about, time management, organization, compliance than it is really about skills and content knowledge. And then I would have kids, quite frankly, who were doing very poorly in my class who did really well on all the assessments. They just didn't want to do all the assignments that I had assigned, right? And so for me, I had to take a hard look at like, okay, what does this grade really represent? And am I comfortable with that? And I think in this moment, unfortunately, what I'm seeing is teachers are so desperate to get kids to just show up, to do anything, that they're giving out even more points than they ever have before, right? As these carrots to try to lure kids into like showing up and doing the work. And I totally get it, but I think it's moving in the wrong direction. I think it reinforces this myopic kind of focus on the accumulation of points instead of a focus on development and learning as a process, which is where I obviously want the focus to be. So when it comes to this moment and assessment, I want teachers, I think part of what's exhausting right now is teachers are spending so much time in the design work, right? Like they're designing for this new teaching and learning landscape. They're maybe designing for a population online and one in the class. And then they're still trying to grade everything. And they're grading even more than they have in the past. And it's just a bombastic amount of work. And for me, I wish teachers would take a step back and really think about like, what is the purpose of this work kids are doing? Is it practice? Is it work toward a product? Is it a finished product or an assessment? And where does it make sense for me as the educator with limited time and energy to put that time and energy, right? To give feedback or to grade something that kids have completed. I want that to be much more intentional so that teachers aren't taking these massive stacks of, literal digital work home to grade in their evenings and weekends when that grading process isn't really functioning to move the needle. So that's one part of this moment where again, it's kind of like a less is more. Maybe if we put less points on everything, we have more time for feedback on the things that really matter, that kids can take that feedback and act on it. And then if it is a finished kind of an assessment, a final assessment, I would love for teachers to get away from, especially online, using really traditional forms of assessment. Teachers are so worried about kids cheating and Googling things. And I'm like, but if you give them a test where they can Google the answers, like, they're going to Google the answers. So how do we reimagine learning and assessment in this moment? Can we embrace a more creative approach, thinking about performance tasks, project-based forms of assessment, and then really building in some student agency into that. So one of my favorite examples to share with teachers, I have this like project choice board, and there are 6 different project structures. And when I say project structures, it just means that the the choice board isn't specific to like a unit of study. These project structures could be used to demonstrate learning at the end of any learning cycle or at the end of any unit. So there are things like, take an idea from this unit or from this learning cycle, flesh it out, script and deliver a TED Talk, like a mini TED Talk, or construct a model to like demonstrate a concept or a process that you learned, or create a multimedia slideshow, pulling together text and images and media, or write a children's book or a little children's story unpacking one of these complex concepts. So really, it's about, I think, being more creative, embracing those more like performance-based, authentic forms of assessment, and then building choice. So students, anybody who kind of knows anything about universal design for learning has probably heard like, hey, kids don't communicate and express themselves all in the same way. And so how do we build in some of that choice and voice so they can decide, hey, I think this is going to be a really successful avenue for me to share my learning with my teacher and my classmates.
And obviously, all of those kinds of projects and choice boards and things take longer for students to do. They also take longer for teachers to plan sometimes when you're still used to it, or when you're not used to it when you're in the beginning stages.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what we're saying here really is quality over quantity, to maybe grade less, assess less, and make sure that those grades you are taking actually are a reflection of what students know and are able to do. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I know that's a really tricky conversation. The knee-jerk response is, well, if I don't grade everything, they won't do it. And, maybe some kids won't. And, is that the reason to then spend hours and hours putting grades on everything? I just don't think so. So I think there just needs to be that higher level of intentionality around what we're grading, why we're grading, and what's going to be the benefit for students of grading something or giving feedback to something. Because if they're not going to act on feedback, then covering a paper and a bunch of comments isn't a great use of anybody's time. So it's just that strategic thinking and questioning some of the things that we've just kind of always done and never really thought about or questioned.
Mm-hmm. Is there anything else teachers can be doing to simplify assessment in the virtual classroom?
Well, don't try to assess every part of every assignment every time. That is something I see a lot. So whether it's teachers using more traditional forms of assessment, like having kids write an essay, or whether it's more kind of performance-based or authentic, and it's like some kind of a project, then, really drill down. Like, what were the learning objectives? What were the target standards that informed the design of this unit or this learning cycle? And then let's pull some of those, 2, maybe 3, and design a standard aligned rubric. Because if really the learning objectives for everybody in a unit are the same, then you should be able to use that standard aligned rubric with 2 or maybe 3 criteria to evaluate any product kids are creating to demonstrate their learning. And what I see teachers doing is feeling that pressure to assess every single part of every single piece every single time. And I'm like, I don't think that's necessary. So if I am working with a, English teacher who is teaching argumentative writing, they're likely going to have students do maybe a couple of different argumentative pieces throughout the year. So maybe the pieces I assess on the first argumentative writing sample are different from the 2 criteria I decide to assess the next time students write another argumentative piece. So again, it just kind of narrowing the scope. And I think that's not only good for us, it's great for kids, because sometimes I think it's easy to forget how overwhelming it is to receive just massive amounts of feedback, or, a rubric with 10 different items that have been assessed. For a kid to take that in and do something with it, it's a tall order.
Mm-hmm. How do attendance issues factor into this? Because I'm thinking about teachers, particularly at the secondary level, who are trying to assess kids who have barely turned in any work. And they're like, report cards are coming up, and I have like 2 things from this kid. What am I supposed to do? Do you have any advice for teachers who are having trouble getting kids to show up and having trouble getting enough grades or enough accurate assessments to reflect what the student knows?
I mean, on some level, the first thing we have to do is try to connect with that child or the family or the family supporting that child, and figure out what is the barrier? Why aren't they coming? Because we can make all kinds of assumptions about why kids don't show up that could be absolutely inaccurate. And I think so the first step is about trying to connect with that learner, the family. How do we identify the barriers? How do we try to work through them? I also think that, it was fascinating for me in my journey toward more of a standards-based approach to grading was that I was literally entering each assessment score, each individual assessment score. So if I had a rubric that had 3 standards on it, each of those separate scores would be entered individually. And what I found is when I was grading less, where kids weren't being penalized all the time for missing just like dozens and dozens of assignments, and I started to be much more strategic about how I was grading and what was going in the grade book. It was like I had a couple students who were not strong writers. English was not their first language. They really struggled every time we did a process piece of writing. And when I shifted to standards-based, what I realized was if I'm assessing, the strength of your topic sentence and your evidence and your analysis, then you actually didn't have to write the entire 5-paragraph essay or whatever it was for me to assess those pieces, right? There were kids who might have only written 2 paragraphs. And in my old model, it's like, well, you didn't do the assignment, it's an F. In the new model, it was like, okay, in what you submitted, what are your skills telling me about where you are? And so I almost think that reimagining our approach to what we grade and how we go about that grading can actually benefit kids who, for whatever reason, don't come every day, or for whatever reason, don't submit all of the work. And, that's not a problem solver for a kid who's been in class twice in a semester and turned in one thing. Like, there's not a lot to reimagine there if we can't connect with that student and that student's family. I mean, I think there is a degree in education where we feel all this responsibility to everybody has to succeed, but we can only do so much. And especially when kids aren't walking through a door where we have that regular access to them physically to have those conversations. I mean, I think on some level we do what we can do, and then we just have to let go a little bit and recognize that there's a lot going on in the background of people's lives right now, and a kid not showing up and a kid not doing assignment might have nothing to do with us or our class.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I think that's the case even when we're not in a pandemic. It's so easy to take it personally when a student doesn't do their work, or doesn't finish an assignment. It's like, well, they don't respect my authority, or, they think the assignment was boring, or they don't like me. There's all kinds of stories that we can tell ourselves. And often it just has nothing to do with us. The kid's mind is elsewhere. There's other things going on. And plus they're children. I mean, I know even as an adult trying to work from home, it is very difficult to focus and concentrate.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
What do you think about some of the unrealistic expectations that are being pushed right now? Because I'm agreeing 100% with everything that you're saying. And I know that, I think most teachers would too, but there's probably some folks listening to this and thinking, man, I really need my superintendent to get this message through their head. Specifically, I'm thinking about people who work in schools that are trying to hold kids and teachers to the old standards, to whatever they were doing last year. We're going to keep pace. We're going to test them the same way. They're going to master just as much content and skills this year as they would if there was no such thing as COVID. And so I'm wondering if there's anything that I'm sure you have some things to say to that. I'm wondering if you have some practical steps that teachers could take to advocate for better working and learning conditions and appropriate expectations.
Yeah, I do think, gosh, it's so hard to push that change in mindset from the ground up. Man, I have been that teacher trying to do that exact same thing when leadership was on a very different page, obviously different scenario than we're in now. But if you have if you're feeling like expectations are just wildly unrealistic, I think the first place to start is either if you have a PLC that you work with on your campus or you have a department, just really having an honest conversation at that level, not just individually feeling like you have to go it alone and talk to your principal or your superintendent or whatever it may be, but connect with those people that you have already been asked to kind of design with and idea share with, and figure out with them, what is their experience? Can you work together to, again, use this whole idea of framing and focusing around priority standards and skills, concepts for your subject area, and then bring that once you have kind of an idea of how you want to approach it, because I think leaders tend to be so action oriented, like what needs to get done, what are the steps? And so if a teacher just says, oh my gosh, these expectations are wildly unrealistic, like we're drowning here, you're going to lose great people from this school, approach it from a perspective that a leader could appreciate. Articulate the why. Why are you having this conversation? And then present a clear how. What does your PLC, what does your department team want to do to try to make this work better? And, I think honestly, the schools where leaders are thinking outside the box and they're understanding that this is kind of a moment in education and we're never going to return exactly to the way things were before. And so we need to be flexible. We need to think about how to best serve kids. And quite frankly, we need to figure out how to keep amazing people in this profession because as, teacher engagement starts to dip because student engagement is dipping because they're very reciprocal. If you read any of the research around it, teacher engagement's linked to job satisfaction and emotional kind of that emotional piece. And so how do we keep them engaged? Because that is my biggest fear right now is just losing phenomenal people in education because of unrealistic expectations.
Yes. Yes, I am right there with you. And I love this advice to get together with your PLC, with your grade level team, get together with another group of teachers. And it kind of ties back to what we were talking about in the beginning about figuring out what's most important and thinking, okay, so I'm being told to do these 30 things. I do not have the time for these 30 things. My kids cannot handle these 30 things. Let me sit down with my colleagues and think through what is the stuff that is most important for kids to know? What do they really need to do? What is really going to make an impact for them? If we want them to master these standards are the most important ones. Maybe these 5 activities are the most crucial. Can we then bring that to administration and say, hey, we think kids would actually get a lot more out of it if we stopped doing this, this, and this, and we tried this, this, and this. Could we do that for the next 9 weeks? Could we do that for the next 4 weeks? Come with a specific plan or solution in mind. I think there's some potential there because, as you said, a lot of leaders realize that this is a very distinct moment in time. And there aren't any perfect solutions right now, and that this is a time for experimenting and figuring out what is going to work that we want to carry through to the next school year. And I think a lot of school leaders, if not most school leaders, would be thrilled to have teachers come to them and say, hey, we've actually thought through this curriculum and we think we have a way to do it even better for our particular students.
Absolutely, because leaders are making a million decisions a day too, right? Like it's easy to forget like all the stuff that they're responsible for. And it's a lot easier to say yes to a clear plan, like an action plan, than it is to say, okay, I hear you're struggling and now I have to figure out what's a plan. And quite frankly, the leader is not going to be able to design a plan that is going to necessarily work for every department. Like the teachers in that department or that PLC, they have that expertise. They know, like if I'm an English teacher and I'm sending these 9th graders to 10th grade next year, and we've just been through this crazy online kind of situation, what specific skills and like content knowledge do they need to be successful in next year's 10th grade English class? And, maybe they don't need to read 5 novels over the course of the year to get there. Maybe we focus on 2 or 3 and we drill down into specific reading strategies and writing kind of formats that they're going to need to build on next year. So again, it also is us owning our own expertise in that design of a plan that we want to use moving forward, instead of saying, hey, this is a problem, fix it. And then you get given a plan and you're kind of like, ew, I don't like this plan either.
Yeah, that's right. That's such a good point because I think teachers are so used to having their expertise dismissed and to be told by people who are not in the classroom, told by people who have maybe never been in a classroom, how they should be teaching. And you start to question yourself and think that your experience, your education, that your day-to-day work with kids doesn't actually mean anything, and that you need someone else outside of yourself to come up with a solution. And it's such a great point that, first of all, if you sit and you wait for someone in leadership to come up with a solution for you, that may never come because those leaders have other problems they're trying to solve. They're also trying to make kids and parents and teachers and community stakeholders and politicians and everybody else happy, and it's not possible. So they may not ever come up with a solution. And even if they do, no one knows your situation as well as you do. No one knows your kids and what goes on in your classroom the way that you do. And if you can come up with a solution and present that rather than expecting someone else to create it for you, your solution's probably going to be better anyways.
Well, and think about the agency. We always talk about student agency being so powerful, but like, let's hear it for teacher agency. Exactly. Like, you come up with what's going to work for you. You take your expertise and apply it.
Yes. Are there any other specific things that teachers in a virtual or a hybrid classroom can do right now that would help lighten their workload and take some of this pressure off?
I think if right now teachers are doing a lot of, putting points on or grading practice and review, I'm working with a couple of teachers right now who were drowning in the workload. And so we've put in these kind of structures within the virtual sessions where every single time the practice and review kids did like the day before earlier in the week, they're actually in teams, in breakout rooms, self-assessing, working through moments of challenge. So if it's a math class and it's a set, they did a practice set of problems, they're in a breakout room, they have access to usually the like one of the math teachers I'm working with, he will walk through and do a recording kind of going through the solution for one problem. And then he gives them an answer key. So they can reference his kind of process as they're looking through the other ones, but it's their job to like bring that critical eye to the work they did and lean on a support network in order to figure out, ooh, I screwed up number 3. Like, how did I do that? What'd you guys do? And what's fascinating is I've had teachers who assume, oh, if I don't grade it, students won't do it. And the feedback from the students in the 3 kind of classes I'm in right now, where we're doing this on a daily basis, is this is so helpful. Like, I'm finally learning from these assignments. So the teacher isn't taking that work and grading it and putting it in a grade book. The teacher is making that review and practice an opportunity to continue learning and developing and growing. And it's just like, they're just small shifts and they have such a profound impact.
Yes, it doesn't necessarily mean overhauling everything that you do, especially at a time when we feel like everything's already been overhauled.
Exactly.
There are just little hacks, tips, things like that. Anything else like that you want to share?
Let me think. What other things have I had kids do? I mean, that's a big one. I also think, honestly, like, I know a lot of teachers hear, oh, make a video. And they're like, oh, but that takes time. And one of the things that I talk a lot about is I lean on video so hard, regardless of the situation. And I think, making really short videos where if everybody has to hear the same thing, whether it's a concept or we're introducing a skill or a process, capture that foundational explanation in a video, because that video will put students in control of the pace at which they consume and process that information. They can pause, they can rewind, and then they can watch it 10 times if they need to. And we can spend our time, not so much of it talking at kids, but instead connecting with them and really, okay, you saw this video, let's build on it. And let's ideally build on it in small groups so that as you're playing around with these concepts and these new skills, I can support you. I think for a lot of students, so much time is spent in these sessions on hearing kind of the introduction of new information, and they're not getting the support they need as they try to take that new information and do something with it. And that's where I think even if they're just 3-5-minute videos, they do this weird kind of wonderful magic of just freeing us to focus on other things. And so it may not seem like, oh, that's going to save time, but it really, really does, especially if they're videos that hit concepts and skills that, quite frankly, kids are going to be returning to throughout the year. And we've all had to re-explain the same context or concepts a dozen times in a class, and it just gets exhausting. And so thinking about strategic use of video in this moment, I think, can be incredibly powerful.
Yes, exactly. It's an investment of time. You can either
Yes.
spend your time repeating yourself over and over and over again, or else you can invest that time, hopefully working in batches, like make
Yes.
a running list of all the videos or screencasts that you need to make. The kids are constantly forgetting how to do this, or they're running into a problem with this. And just make a list and then
Mm-hmm.
sit down and do it in a batch, once a week, every other week, once a month, whatever it needs to be. And then hopefully that's actually something from this school year that you can for sure use next school year.
Yes.
Because, it's very exhausting to think about, I'm doing all of this work and the next school year, who even knows what we're going to be
I
doing and what it's
know.
going to look like. But these videos, I mean, you can use when kids are absent, you can use for review, you can use in small group, like they can be repurposed in so many ways for so much time to come. And I think thinking about where can I invest my time to get that return back later is really, really empowering versus like, oh my gosh, it's going to take me forever to do this. And it's so much faster if I just, take the shortcut now and just keep repeating myself. Invest that time that will pay off dividends for you later.
Absolutely. And a lot of teachers will say, well, but if I do it live, then everybody heard it. And I'm like, well, they might have been there. They might have actually heard it, but that doesn't mean they understood it. It doesn't mean they're going to remember it, you know? So yeah, it really is an investment of time. And if you just remember, your videos don't have to be perfect. Live instruction is not perfect. If you stumble a little, just keep on going. And then it does pay dividends in the future. I cannot agree more.
I have been so impressed with your blog posts and the other resources that you've been putting out about virtual and blended learning. This is a drum that you have been beating for many years before a pandemic, before it was cool and trendy, before a lot of people got on board.
Right.
And it is finally the Dr. Catlin Tucker moment to shine and have everybody else see the thing that you've been passionate about all along. And so your long-term expertise on this, not just jumping on a bandwagon, but actually believing that there are great things for kids and teachers in this way of teaching and learning. It shines through because you've already had a chance to work out so many of the practical things that the rest of us are just sort of like catching up on and learning on the fly. So can you tell people where they can learn more from you? Your blog posts, I know you're sharing lots of great stuff. You've been doing some webinars lately too, right?
Yeah, I did a webinar. I do try to keep everything on my blog super practical, resources, things you can copy and modify and use with your kids. And then for anybody who's like, oh my gosh, I just need help getting started, I do have a Getting Started with Blended and Online Learning course through Teachable. And for those who are like, okay, I've gotten started, but like I really want to go further, there's an Advancing with Blended and Online Learning. So anybody who wants to kind of go at their own pace and do some kind of self-paced learning can do that. I'm obviously on Twitter if people have questions or comments or a request for resource. You know, like if you heard me mention the project choice board and you're like, oh my gosh, I want to see that, just send me a note on Twitter and I can make sure that you get it. So I'm happy to be a resource for people moving forward for sure.
Okay, awesome. I'm going to put all those links in the show notes and in the blog post. I'm also going to link to some of the Google slide templates that you have freely shared on your blog, things for virtual stations and things like that teachers can just make a copy of and tweak for their own use. I think they're so cool.
Perfect. Well, thank you.
So I want to close out the show with a takeaway truth, something that you want people to remember in the week ahead. So what is something that you wish every teacher understood about really making the best of this school year and using their time well with students in a virtual or a blended environment?
I would love it if teachers really recognized that the value we bring to the classroom, be it a physical space or a virtual one, it isn't in our subject area expertise. It isn't in our pedagogical expertise. That's important, but our real value in this moment, in every moment, is in connection. So I would love for teachers to be thinking about how do we honor that in the design and facilitation of these learning experiences that we're kind of architecting right now. Are we setting ourselves up as that kind of teacher-centered classroom where the focus is on transfer of information because we think our value is expert? Or are we really focusing on creating student-centered learning experiences where our focus is on connecting with students, facilitating learning? Because really, it's that human side of teaching that technology can never replace. And so just to really remember that that is such a critical part of the work that we're doing now, but always.